All right, we're going to go and get started. Thanks for coming. This presentation is on how to get accepted by Stanford and Ivy League universities. I'm Dan Lee, and I'm here with Vitaly Borshan. We are the co-founders of Solomon Admissions Consulting. And as we're going along, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to us in the chat boxes. We will go ahead and answer them at the end of the presentation. So Vitaly and I are both graduates of Georgetown University Law Center. We have over a decade of admissions consulting experience getting applicants into top 20 schools, and our success rate is that over 90% of our students get into one of their top 3 choice colleges. So why should you care? Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford reject over 60% of applicants who have both a perfect 4.0 unweighted GPA and a perfect 2400 on the SAT. Stanford in particular rejects over 70% of its students with perfect SAT scores. These are the 2014 average acceptance rates at a lot of the top schools in the country. And so in the first column, you will see the average acceptance rate at universities about a decade ago in 2005. The second column is the average acceptance rate this past year, and the third column is the acceptance rate of the students that we work with. So for instance, for Columbia University, about 10 years ago, their acceptance rate was 12%. This past year, the acceptance rate at Columbia University in the second column was 6.9%. 28.2% of the students we worked with last year got into Columbia. Okay, so this is how elite colleges generally evaluate applicants overall. Most elite universities give you both an academic and a personal score. At a lot of universities, your academic score is predetermined based in large part on your SAT-1 and ACT score, as well as your SAT-2 subject scores, which make up about roughly 25% of your overall rating. And your grades, your class rank, and your course difficulty also make up roughly 25% of your overall rating, depending on what school you're applying to. 50% of your application is improvable at the time that you apply, and can be vastly improved. And so 25% of your overall application is generally composed of your personal statement, your supplemental essays. Every school you apply to will have a school-specific supplemental essay asking why you want to go to UPenn or why you want to go to Cornell. And in cases where you have lower grades, you often want to explain that away in an addendum, which is in the additional information section of the common application. The other 25% of your overall rating is typically based on your activity sheet, detailing your extracurricular activities in very, very detailed form aside from the common application. Your interview, a lot of schools require interviews, and most importantly, your recommendation letters. Your recommendation letters, especially at the top schools, are very important. So now I'm going to talk briefly about how Stanford evaluates applicants. And just keep in mind, Stanford and the Ivies, they evaluate applicants very similarly, but there are some distinct differences to keep in mind. So the first thing to know is that when you apply to Stanford, Stanford recalculates your GPA. And so the way they do this is they use a formula, and the formula takes into account only your grades from 10th and 11th grade. So your grades from freshman year, if you got a B, 1 or 2 Bs in your freshman year, those are thrown out because they don't look at your freshman year grades. Stanford only looks at your academic courses, and so they basically, if you took PE or typing or band or orchestra in 10th or 11th grade, those classes do not factor into your recalculated GPA. And the most important thing to keep in mind is that Stanford does flat grading to recalculate your GPA. And so what that means is that if you have an A- on your transcript, that's really good for you because an A- becomes converted to an A when Stanford recalculates your GPA. And on the flip side, if you have a B+ on your transcript, that's going to be very bad because Stanford actually downgrades B+ to Bs. And so, like I said, with flat grading at Stanford, it's great if you have an A- or a B- on your transcript because those grades get upgraded. if you have a B plus or a C plus, it's really bad because those grades actually get downgraded. So the Stanford applicant rating system, Stanford basically assigns every applicant 3 separate ratings, and each of the ratings is on a 1 to 6 scale, with 1 being the highest score and 6 being the lowest score. And so Stanford gives you an academic rating, which is on a 1 to 6 score. They give you an extracurricular rating, which is also 1 to 6, and they also give you an intellectual vitality rating, which is on a 1 to 6 scale. And one thing I'll note is that for students who are rated at the highest level, so at the highest level at Stanford, they would be an academic 1, an extracurricular 1, and an intellectual vitality 1. People who are triple 1s, 1-1-1s across the board are extremely rare, even in the applicant pool at Stanford, and they comprise less than 1% of the applicants at Stanford. So the Stanford academic and extracurricular ratings I will go into a little bit later because they are very similar to the way that the Ivy Leagues rate applicants. But what sets Stanford apart from the Ivy League when they rate applicants is that Stanford actually gives all applicants a separate what they call intellectual vitality rating. And so intellectual vitality is simply measuring how much a student loves learning for the sake of learning, and they're really looking at, does a student have perfect grades because they want to get into Stanford, or do they have perfect grades because they really love learning and they just can't get enough of reading up on independent research topics and doing research on their own outside the classroom? That's really what they're looking for. Stanford is not looking for straight A students. They're looking for straight A students who really, really love learning at a high level outside the classroom, and that's what the intellectual vitality rating measures at Stanford. And just keep in mind, this rating is used to weed out the vast majority of students who are straight A students, because a lot of straight A students just flat out don't really love learning that much. And so here's an example of what someone who is rated as an intellectual vitality 1, which is the highest rating at Stanford, would look like. They would have done independent academic research outside the classroom with a college professor, hopefully leading to published research in a journal. And so they typically look for students who've done research for multiple years, outside the classroom with a professor on a topic that they're very passionate about. Stanford also has an intellectual vitality supplemental essay, and I'll get into that more detail on that later. They want typically applicants who are rated a 1 write a phenomenal intellectual vitality supplemental essay at Stanford. And basically what they're looking for is that you show a true love of learning for the sake of learning at a high level outside the classroom. And keep in mind, this is completely independent from your grades. And so the mistake a lot of students make is that they just assume that because they have straight A's or scored in the 99th percentile on the SAT, that they're automatically going to be rated high in terms of intellectual vitality at Stanford. This is a completely separate rating from your grades and test scores. It's not uncommon to find students who are academically rated a 1, which is basically they are in the top 1% of their class in high school grade-wise, and they score over 2,300 on the SAT. A lot of times those students are rated very low in terms of intellectual vitality, even as low as a 3 or 4 out of 6. So the intellectual vitality rating at Stanford is very, very important, and it's basically asking whether, number 1, does the applicant take ownership of his or her education outside of the classroom? The second major thing they're asking is the applicant the kind of student who would enrich the learning of other Stanford students? And most importantly, they're asking whether the applicant is passionate about learning. So the Stanford supplemental essays, there's 3 different supplemental essays. One is a note to your roommate, one asks what matters to you and why, but the most important Stanford supplemental essay by far is the intellectual vitality essay, because it directly correlates to one of the 3 major ratings that Stanford gives you. So every year Stanford asks students that the prompt is, Stanford students possess an intellectual vitality. Reflect on an idea or experience that has been important to your intellectual development. It's a 250-word supplemental essay. They ask it every year. So I like to call this essay the never-ending dinner conversation essay, because the ideal answer to this essay is very similar to having a very, very engaging intellectual conversation during dinner, and it just goes on and spills over past dinner, and you just can't stop talking about it because it's a topic that really excites you. So basically, who does Stanford weed out using their intellectual vitality essay question? Stanford uses this question in many cases to weed out perfect students who are not intellectuals, who get perfect grades and test scores for the sake of getting into Stanford and getting a high-paying job, and not because they actually love learning. And this is why I mentioned before that a lot of students who are 4.0 students who have extremely high SAT scores actually rate very low on the intellectual vitality scale, because they, in many cases, they don't actually enjoy the process of learning. They're learning because they want to get into Stanford, and that's not what Stanford's looking for. So this essay is testing whether you really love learning for the sake of learning or for the sake of getting into Stanford. And so a stereotypical bad answer to this question would talk about Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States, which a lot of high school students use to study for the AP US History exam. A great answer to the Stanford intellectual vitality question would address one intellectual idea which reveals your love of learning far beyond the classroom walls for the sake of learning. And this one idea, ideally, could be translated to undergraduate research and academic publication while you're at Stanford, and is hopefully related to your academic major or future career goals. So a couple of key differences between Stanford and the Ivies in terms of the evaluation process. Unlike the Ivies, Stanford tends to admit the most compelling applicant, not necessarily the most qualified applicant on paper. And so when I say the most compelling applicant, so Stanford gives you 3 different ratings. They give you an academic rating, an extracurricular rating, and an intellectual vitality rating. So a lot of times at Stanford, they will admit someone who's a 1-3-2 on that scale over someone who's even like a 1-2-2, simply because the person who's a 1-3-2 has a more compelling application. Stanford also weighs the SATs less than the Ivies. Stanford cares a lot about your GPA. They tend to be more forgiving of the SATs than the Ivies. The other thing, this is very important, Stanford weighs the supplemental essays much more heavily than the Ivies, and it's because of the fact that they are looking for, in many cases, the most compelling applicant, not necessarily the applicant who is the most qualified on paper. Stanford also weighs legacy status and athletic recruiting more heavily than the Ivies. A much larger percentage of the incoming class at Stanford is composed of legacies and recruited athletes than at the Ivies. And as I pointed out before, Stanford assigns applicants a separate intellectual vitality rating, which the Ivies do not do. The Ivy League schools actually incorporate the intellectual vitality rating into their academic rating. The other thing to keep in mind is that Stanford does not give as big a boost to early action applicants. So one question I had is, how about independent research without a college professor, but that led to a publication? Is the professor piece important, or the research publication portion? They're looking for just learning at a high level outside the classroom. So even though there was no professor involved, that's very impressive, and that would definitely count towards having a very high intellectual vitality rating. The only downside to that might be that oftentimes they look at the recommendation letters very closely at Stanford to determine both your academic rating as well as your intellectual vitality rating. And so because of that, it's often good to do research with a professor, because recommendation letters from professors carry a good amount of weight, especially if you've done research with them. Now we're going to move on to how do Ivy League schools evaluate applicants. So the Ivy League applicant rating system is very similar across all Ivy League schools. Ivy League schools assign every applicant 2 separate ratings, and it can be on varying scales, but it's often on a 1 to 9 scale. And so they give you 2 different ratings. They give you an academic rating, and they give you a personal rating. So the academic rating is on a 1 to 9 scale, but varies by school, with 9 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. Ivy League schools also give you an academic index score out of a possible 240 points. And this index score is calculated based on a combination of your class rank, your GPA, your SAT, and importantly, your SAT-2 scores. So your SAT-2 scores factor very heavily in your academic index score at the Ivy Leagues, and that's something that a lot of students don't realize. The Ivy League schools also give you a personal rating on a 1 to 9 scale, 9 being the highest. And like I said, the personal rating typically is a combination of your essays as well as your extracurricular activities. So that said, we're going to look at a couple of examples of what a academic 9 and academic 7 a personal 9 and a personal 7 would be. So typically, academic applicants score academic 9 out of 9, which is the highest rating at the Ivy League schools. They are definitely in the top 1 to 2% of their high school class. Over 50% of the incoming class is made up of valedictorians and salutatorians. And so class rank is incredibly important. They want to see that you've taken the most challenging course load of AP courses. Your SAT / ACT and your SAT scores are typically in the 99th percentile. Recommendation letters are incredibly important to differentiate between academic 7s versus academic 9s. Typically, an academic 9 has glowing letters of recommendation indicating that the student is the best out of applicants from the past several years from his or her high school. Academic 9s also have an intense level of learning, as evidenced by academic research outside the classroom with a college professor, leading to publication in a journal. And an academic 9 out of 9 would be somebody who has the potential to be a leader in his or her academic field in the future. So most students who apply to the Ivies are not academic 9s. They fall typically in the academic 5 to 7 range. So an academic 7 out of 9 would be someone who is in the top 5% of his or her high school class, still taking the most challenging course load of AP courses. The SAT, ACT, and the SAT 2 scores would typically be above the 95th percentile. Recommendation letters would be strong but unexceptional. And the key difference is that academic 7s really lack the intense level of learning of academic 9s. So in a lot of cases, academic 7s will have some independent reading that they've done outside the classroom, but no published research with a professor. And in many cases, academic 7s are simply driven to achieve by competition more so than by true love of learning. And so this would be the equivalent of, at Stanford, their intellectual vitality rating. What really distinguishes the academic 9s from the 7s is not necessarily the test scores and the GPA. It's that true love of learning for the sake of learning that the top schools really, really look for. So now we're going to move on to the personal rating. So personal rating, someone who is a perfect 9 out of 9 is basically someone who has achieved great things in one specialized area with awards at the national level. So we're talking about people who are published authors. We're talking about Intel STS finalists. Basically, you're the top 40 in the country for Intel. You can be an Olympic medalist. You can be a soloist on the violin or piano at Carnegie Hall. You're a U.S. Math Olympiad qualifier, and or you have a patent pending. And obviously, with the patent, it's very important to point out that universities are very, very good at figuring out whether your parents helped you get that patent. And so it has to be very clear that the student came up with the patent on their own, and that would be considered a personal rating of 9. A personal rating of 7 out of 9 would be, more characteristic of most applicants. It would be awards at the regional level, significant commitment at a high level to a few activities. So examples of people who fall under the personal rating of 7 would be people who are student body presidents, people who've qualified for the all-state orchestra, captain of the varsity sports team, or a nationally ranked debater. Typically, people who are rated a 7 out of 9 are well-rounded and involved, but not the most passionate about anything. They tend to be the jack of all trades, the master of none. And if you are someone who has a personal rating of 7, your essays are incredibly important, and they will, in many cases, determine whether you get into Ivy League schools or not, just because you're right on the border. So one thing to keep in mind is that the Ivy League schools, unlike Stanford, they have a separate engineering admissions process at certain schools. And so the separate engineering admissions process comes into play most notably at Columbia, Cornell, and at UPenn. They have a separate admissions process for the engineering applicants. And this is important because engineering faculty are often on the admissions committee, especially at Columbia. And so there's a greater emphasis on grades and test scores, and there's also a greater emphasis on academic research in engineering. The next topic we're going to cover that will greatly increase your chances of getting into Stanford or an Ivy League school is applying early decision or early action by the November 1st deadline. And so There's a quick question here. The question is asking, is applying for early admission to Stanford recommended? The answer is it depends on who you are. If you are a legacy or a recruited athlete, absolutely. If you are not a legacy or recruited athlete at Stanford, it's typically not as advantageous to apply early action to Stanford. The early action acceptance rate at Stanford last year was 10%. The overall acceptance rate was 5%. And that may seem large on paper, but when you compare it to the advantage of applying early at a lot of the other top schools, it's not nearly as advantageous. Ivy League early decision and early action. So, most Ivy League and other top universities fill approximately 50% of the incoming available seats in their incoming freshman class through either early decision or early action, and the deadline for both early decision and early action at all the top schools is November 1st. One thing to keep in mind is that early decision is binding, and so because it's binding, it's actually more advantageous to apply early decision somewhere than it is to apply early action where it's non-binding. Typically, the average advantage conferred by applying early decision or early action is the academic equivalent of adding about 150 points to your SAT score, and that's been something that's been published in many different studies. The thing that studies don't point out is the fact that in addition to being advantageous academically, they actually cut you more slack extracurricularly if you apply early decision or early action because you're competing against a weaker applicant pool. So the kind of the caveat to this rule is that the early decision, early action applicants at schools not named Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and Princeton compete against a much weaker pool of applicants. So for instance, if you are going to apply early decision to Duke or early decision to Cornell, the pool of applicants at a Duke or a Cornell is going to be much weaker for early decision than they will be for regular decision, just because you're not competing directly against the people who would apply regular decision to Duke and Cornell who applied early to Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and Princeton. Typically Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and Princeton, especially Harvard, Harvard is the extreme case where typically the best students in the country tend to apply early to Harvard, and because of that, Harvard is kind of the exception where the early pool at Harvard tends to be significantly stronger than the regular decision pool. The other advantage of applying early action or early decision is that your application is read much more closely since there's a lot more time and a lot less applicants. And typically, one thing you'll find is that borderline applicants who are often waitlisted regular decision would have gotten in had they applied early decision or early action in many cases. I can't tell you how many applicants I've worked with where I've pushed them to apply early decision somewhere. They decided not to, and then they ended up on the wait list. And I often tell them that, had you applied regular early decision, you would have gotten in, So it's very, very important to apply early decision or early action. So the November 1st deadline, once again, is for early decision and early action. And this is a chart with the Ivy League schools. The first column is the early decision, early action acceptance rate. The second column is the regular decision acceptance rate. And the third column is the percentage of the incoming freshman class filled by early decision or early action. So the disparities are huge. I mean, for instance, at Brown, the early decision acceptance rate last year at Brown was 20%. Regular decision acceptance rate was 7.2%. They filled almost 40% of their incoming class through early decision. Columbia, the early decision acceptance rate last year was 18.5%. The regular decision acceptance rate was 4.9%, which is abysmal, and they filled 45% of their incoming class through early decision, and the list goes on and on down. One notable one to point out is Dartmouth. Dartmouth confers a huge advantage on early decision applicants. 26% of early decision applicants get into Dartmouth versus 8.8% for regular decision, and Dartmouth fills 43% of its incoming freshman class through early decision. Now we're going to talk about strategic positioning in crafting one's narrative. So what is strategic positioning? Strategic positioning is simply making your application stand out. So you're positioning your one's strengths against an institution's weaknesses. So a tennis analogy would be if any of you are tennis fans and are going to watch the upcoming U.S. Open, Rafael Nadal plays left-handed, and he's got a very wicked left-handed forehand, and Roger Federer is obviously right-handed, and he has a much weaker one-handed backhand, and so Nadal often structures points so that the shots go from his lefty forehand to Federer's weaker one-handed backhand. And so you're really lining up your strengths against an institution's weaknesses to make you stand out. So an example of that would be that it's more advantageous for an engineering whiz with science awards to market his strong engineering background at Yale, where not as many engineering majors apply, versus marketing it to MIT, where he would blend into the crowd. So I'm going to talk about building a class. Admissions committees are often concerned with building a class. So basically, the top colleges are not looking for well-rounded incoming classes. The top colleges are looking for well-rounded incoming classes, but they're not looking for well-rounded students. And so they're looking for students who are specialists who are the best at one thing. You saw the extracurricular ratings. Students who are a personal or extracurricular 9 out of 9 tend to be students who are the best at one thing, So the key question you got to ask is, who are you going to be in the incoming class? And that's very important, because if a lot of other people can be who you're going to be in the incoming class, there's a very high probability that you're not going to get in. And so another key question to ask is, what talent or perspective do you bring to the incoming class that no one else brings? And another key question that they're asking is, do you have the potential to be a future leader in your chosen field? So an example of strategic positioning that we get a lot is that a lot of the applicants who come to us end of junior year, start of senior year, tend to be well-rounded students with great numbers. So they tend to be typically straight A students, very high test scores, pretty involved with 2 or 3 activities, but not really the best in the world at any one thing. And so they tend to be well-rounded. And at a lot of the top schools, well-rounded students often end up getting rejected, even with straight A's and very high test scores. So the admissions committees at the top schools typically don't like admitting well-rounded students into their incoming class. They really want students who are focused on 1 or 2 areas and who are specialists. And so the strategic positioning to get around that we use with a lot of students is that we send out a personal statement on a singular passion or intellectual pursuit that makes the applicant seem more focused. The last thing we're going to cover briefly is special considerations for Asian American and Indian applicants. So roughly 50% of the students we work with are high-achieving Asian American and Indian applicants, and they are held to a much higher standard at Ivy League and other top private universities. Here are some quotes from the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Los Angeles Times. So they did a study in 1997 that examined the applications of a lot of high-achieving Asian American students at a lot of the top universities. And they found that back in 1997 in the study, given similarly qualified applicants in terms of GPA and SAT scores and extracurricular activities, it was statistically shown that relative to equally qualified Asian and Indian American applicants at elite colleges, that similarly qualified white applicants were 3 times as likely to be admitted with the same numbers in extracurricular activities as Asian applicants. Similarly qualified legacy applicants were 6 times as likely to be admitted, and similarly qualified recruited athletes were 20 times as likely to be admitted. So to be accepted by a top private university, Asian American students typically need to average an SAT score which is 140 points higher than white students, and that's from a 2009 study. What that study doesn't point out is that Asian American students are also held to a higher standard extracurricularly than other students are. Over the past 20 years, the percentage of Asian American students at Ivy League universities has remained the same at 17 to 20%. In comparison, the percentage of Asian Americans at UC Berkeley, where it became illegal to consider race and admissions, has jumped to 45%. While the number of Asian American applicants to Harvard has almost tripled in the past 2 decades, there were actually fewer Asian American students admitted to the university in 2012 than in 1992. So this chart shows the enrollment trends of Asian American students aged 18 to 21 and elite college enrollment trends from the past 2 decades, 1990 to 2011. And so the total number of Asian American applicants doubled in the last 2 decades, while Asian American enrollment at the Ivy League schools stayed the same or actually dropped in a lot of cases. And so you will see the percentage of Asian American students at Caltech is the only one where the number of Asian American students as a percentage of the incoming class at Caltech went up in relatively equal proportion to the increase in the percentage of Asian American applicants. So common perceptions that elite colleges have of many Asian and Indian applicants, and that must be counted in the application. Number one, Asian American applicants are notorious for being pre-professionally oriented, often majoring in the same fields. I will tell you that, the vast majority of high-achieving Asian and Indian students who come to us, they either want to be doctors, they want to be engineers, or they want to be investment bankers. And so the top schools typically, are looking for a diversity of future interests. And so, I always tell students, Harvard does not want to admit 400 Asian students who want to be engineers and doctors and who play the violin and piano. They're simply not going to do it. The second thing is Asian American students tend to have a homogeneous set of extracurricular interests, such as the stereotypically Asian extracurriculars like tennis, violin, and the math team. Unfortunately, Harvard isn't going to want 400 Asian pre-meds engineers who excel at piano, tennis, and math in this freshman class of 1,600. They're building a class, and 400 Asian pre-meds engineers are not on their list of goals. And the third thing to keep in mind is that Asians are viewed as quiet, diligent students who don't rock the boat. Unfortunately, this is not what elite colleges are looking for, and far too many essays and recommendation letters reinforce this stereotype. So a question we received is, what is a legacy applicant? A legacy applicant at most top schools is an applicant where either your mom or your dad went to undergrad at that school. So, for instance, Harvard has a policy where legacies are only students whose mom or dad actually went to Harvard College. So if mom or dad went to Harvard Law School or Harvard Business School, you're not considered a legacy for applying to Harvard College. At some other top universities, they have a much more liberal definition of what a legacy applicant is, and they will actually allow you to be consider a legacy applicant if your parents or relatives went to grad school at that particular school. So a case study is that we had a Asian male student come to us who applied to engineering, and this Asian male student applying to engineering who came to us for help after he applied to Columbia Engineering on his own. So this student applied to Columbia Engineering on his own, early decision, and it was deferred and then rejected by Columbia, and he came to us after he was deferred and he wanted help. He had a perfect 4.0 GPA unweighted out of a 4.0. He was ranked #1 in his class at a very competitive, highly ranked public school in the Northeast, and he took the most difficult AP course load. His SAT score was a 2340 out of a 2400. He was a Siemens semifinalist. He was an ISEF finalist. He published research in engineering. He was class president. He played varsity tennis. He was first finalist in the All-State Orchestra. He was an Eagle Scout, and he happened to be the founder of the Ecology Club at his high school. And so eventually, after being deferred by Columbia, he came to us. He was, he ended up getting rejected by Columbia after being deferred. So the weaknesses of his application were his essays, his packaging, and his presentation. More specifically, he talked about his engineering research in his application, and he didn't keep in mind that most readers on the committee are not engineers. They are non-technical people who often have an English degree, and they probably were, I read his essays, and they probably fell asleep when they read his essays because they were very boring, And so what we did was instead of having him apply to electrical engineering, we had him apply to environmental engineering because he did ecology. And so his entire application, because he's Asian American, Asian Americans are underrepresented in the conservation movement in the U.S. Conservation movement tends to be predominantly white American. And so because we talked about conservation and ecology in his application, he looked very, very different from other Asian American applicants, and he ended up getting accepted by Cornell Engineering. So we work with a lot of students offering one-on-one counseling for college admissions. The details on advising, we work with a lot of students on their personal statements, including topic suggestions and outline suggestions, and all of our essays are edited by former admissions officers at top 20 schools and Ivy League graduates who have been who are actually professional writers. The most important thing we do is we help out with strategic positioning consulting, and that's really figuring out who you're going to be in the class and how to stand out from the rest of the class. And if you don't get the strategic positioning correct, it doesn't matter how great your essay is, you're simply not going to get in, because they're like I said, they're building a class, and you really have to answer the question, who are you going to be in the class that most other students cannot be. We also help out an extensive amount with the supplemental essays, and once again, those essays are edited by Ivy League graduates who are professional writers. We have insider information on all the top college preferences. We know what Columbia looks for versus what Brown looks for versus what Stanford looks for. We also help out with shoring up weaknesses. A lot of students come to us, junior year of high school. They want to go, they want to go to Stanford, or they want to go to Columbia, and we tell them exactly what the weaknesses in their application are and how to fix those. We help out with recommendation letters. It's very, very important to teach teachers how to write recommendation letters properly, and we help out with that. We do extracurricular activities consulting. A lot of students come to us in 8th and 9th grade. They want to do the 8-year BA MD program at Brown or Northwestern, and we basically map out their entire extracurricular activities for 4 years for them so that they can get in. We do mock interview coaching, and we also help out with financial aid. That's it for us. Let us know if you have any questions. Our contact information is below. You can reach me at dan.lee@solomonadmissions.com, or you can reach Vitaly at vitaly.borshan@solomonadmissions.com. And we're going to go ahead and answer questions, but thanks for coming to our presentation.